I was patrolling the northern stretch of the Blue Ridge late that night, the kind of darkness that seems to settle deep into your bones, colder than the air itself. The forest was quiet, too quiet for a summer evening. The usual rustle of small animals and the distant hoot of an owl were gone, leaving only the soft sigh of wind through the pines. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that the trees just bent in the breeze, but then I noticed it. A faint murmur, almost like a sigh carried on the wind, coming from the dense thicket ahead. I slowed my pace, straining to hear it. The murmurs grew sharper, forming indistinct syllables, almost like warnings, like the forest itself was trying to speak. I shook my head and whispered to myself that it was the wind, a trick of the shadows, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with a damp, earthy smell that clung to my skin and filled my lungs. Each step I took felt louder than it should have, the sound of my boots crunching dry leaves unnaturally sharp in the stillness. Shadows moved differently here. They didn't sway with the trees but seemed to cling to the forest floor, as if watching, waiting. My flashlight cut through the darkness in narrow slices, illuminating trunks scarred by time and the occasional fallen branch, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. I passed over a small clearing where the underbrush was trampled in a circle, as if something, or someone, had been pacing for hours. I froze, gripping the radio tightly, calling in my location. Nothing but static replied. My pulse throbbed in my temples, but my curiosity, or some foolish sense of duty, kept me moving forward. That's when I saw them. At first, just glimpses. Fleeting silhouettes darting between the trees, impossibly fast, impossibly human, yet wrong in ways I couldn't place. My stomach churned. My instincts screamed to turn back, to run, but some stubborn part of me pressed on. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me flinch. The shapes didn't approach directly, but they moved with purpose, always at the edge of my vision, disappearing whenever I tried to focus on them. I started murmuring to myself, reciting the old ranger mantras I'd been taught, to name what I saw, to ground myself, but it did little to quell the rising panic. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The murmuring of the pines became voices, whispers calling out in tones just below comprehension. Names, warnings, fragments of sentences. I felt my footing slip on wet roots, my hands slick on the flashlight as I shined it across the clearing again. There, a figure paused in the darkness. Tall, unnaturally still. And then gone. Just like that, erased into the blackness. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure it would echo across the mountains. Yet the forest held its breath. By the time the first faint light of dawn brushed the ridges, I had made it back to the ranger station, drenched in sweat and shaking, but alive. The clearing and the shadows, the whispers that had pressed so close to my ears, remained burned into my mind. I've walked these trails countless times, yet on windy nights when the pines sway just right, I can still hear them, the murmuring, the warning voices carrying faintly across the mountains. And I know, deep down, that those shadows are still out there, pacing the forest, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to wander into the Blue Ridge under the cloak of night. The memory lingers in the small, quiet moments, the creak of a branch, the soft rustle of pines, the whispering wind that feels too deliberate, too human. I can't shake the sense that the forest remembers me, and I remember it. And sometimes, when the air is still and the darkness thick, I swear I hear it call my name. It was late summer when I stumbled across the campsite, a small clearing tucked just off the northern trails of the Blue Ridge that I patrolled regularly. I had been making my rounds, checking for signs of illegal campers or abandoned debris, when the faint glimmer of a tent caught my flashlight's beam. At first glance, it looked ordinary enough. A small green dome tent pitched neatly among the trees, a cold fire pit nearby, and a half-eaten sandwich left on a plate as if someone had stepped away for just a moment. But the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. There were no footprints leading to or from the site, no tracks that could tell me who had been here or where they had gone. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of small creatures, were absent, swallowed by an eerie silence. I circled the site slowly, flashlight sweeping across the underbrush, and noticed personal items scattered at the edge of the tree lane. A worn baseball cap, a pair of gloves, a small backpack left carelessly open. None of it made sense. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned gear, no clawed dirt, no indication that anyone had left in a hurry. It was as if the campsite had been set down and then vanished on its own. Unease tightened my chest, but the ranger in me took over. I decided to make a temporary post nearby, keeping my patrol vehicle close and my radio on. Night fell fast in the mountains, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, shadows stretching unnaturally long beneath the moonlight. Around 2 in the morning, I was sitting just inside the tree lane, trying to make sense of it all, when I thought I heard my name whispered through the darkness. My heart jumped, and I strained to listen. Again, the sound came, soft but deliberate, like someone standing just beyond the trees, testing me. I shone my flashlight toward the edge of the clearing, and for a fraction of a second, movement flickered between the trunks. A blur, impossible to pin down, slipping from shadow to shadow, just beyond the beam. My pulse hammered, but curiosity or stubbornness pushed me to investigate. I stepped cautiously into the clearing. The tent and fire pit were gone. The ground, which had been scuffed with faint footprints, was now smooth and unbroken, as though it had never been disturbed. Even the sandwich, the plate, the scattered personal items, they had vanished. I blinked, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. A prank, maybe, though who could have done it so perfectly in these remote mountains? I grabbed my camera, hoping the lens might catch something I couldn't see with my own eyes. The viewfinder showed a faint blur retreating into the trees, shapes too quick, too fluid to identify. Figures, maybe, though their forms were indistinct, almost unreal, like smoke dissipating into the night air. I backed toward my post, hands shaking, the whispering continuing softly, now like it was surrounding me, coming from every direction. Each step I took felt heavier, the forest pressing in closer, shadows stretching and twisting with a life of their own. I spoke into my radio, trying to call the station, trying to hear a friendly voice, but only static answered, thick and crackling. The figures seemed to follow, glimpses at the edge of the light, always vanishing when I tried to focus. My skin crawled with the sensation of unseen eyes tracking me, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. I felt trapped in the clearing that no longer existed, moving through a forest that had somehow changed overnight. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes, before I finally made it back to the main trail. The first hint of dawn was brushing the ridge, and with the light came a false sense of relief. I drove back to the ranger station, refusing to look back, though every fiber of me knew something had been there, something that wasn't human, yet not entirely of the forest either. My colleagues didn't notice anything wrong when I returned. The trails all normal in the morning sun, birds chirping and leaves rustling as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. For weeks afterward, I found myself drawn back to that northern stretch, compelled to understand what I had seen. Each time I returned, the forest seemed to warp in subtle ways. Shadows where there shouldn't be, silence too complete, the scent of damp earth heavy and sweet, like something had been lying there waiting. The images on my camera remained the only proof. Faint blurs, fleeting shapes that moved against the grain of reality, almost deliberate, almost aware. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the treetops sway just so, I swear I hear whispers again, calling my name softly through the Blue Ridge night. They are not friendly whispers. They are patient, waiting, almost amused, and they remind me that whatever I saw in that clearing is still out there, still pacing among the trees, still watching. I've told myself it was exhaustion, imagination, the isolation of patrolling alone in the backcountry. But rational thoughts are thin comfort when you know the forest remembers you. I've spent nights listening for the rustle of leaves, every shadow feeling alive, every gust of wind carrying something that isn't quite wind. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see that clearing as clearly as if I were standing there again. The small circle of trampled earth, the empty fire pit, the impossibly fleeting shapes slipping through the trees. The memory is stitched into me, a quiet terror that waits for the right night, for the right wind, to remind me that the woods are never truly empty, and I was only a visitor. I had set out early that morning, the old logging paths winding through the northern ridges of the Blue Ridge like veins in the mountains. The air was cool and damp, lingering mist curling around the trunks of the trees, and the forest seemed unusually still. Normally, even this early, I'd hear the chatter of birds or the rustle of small animals, But that day the woods held a silence that pressed against me, heavy and patient. I moved carefully along the muddy trail, boots sinking slightly with each step, my eyes scanning for anything unusual. That's when I first heard it, a faint, broken call drifting across the ridge. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like children singing off-key, their voices fraying at the edges as if carried through too many bends in the hills. I paused, frowning, certain I was imagining it, but the sound came again, and this time I swore it wasn't random. Curiosity, or maybe a kind of stubborn compulsion, led me forward. I followed the echoes, climbing higher along the path as the fog thickened, rolling in from the valleys below, smothering the world in gray. Shapes moved beneath the mist, pale, fleeting shadows that slipped between the trees with unnatural ease, slipping past the periphery of my vision like smoke. I froze at times, telling myself it was just light and fog playing tricks, yet the movement persisted. My pulse started hammering, boots heavy in the mud, but I couldn't stop myself from following. The voices seemed to guide me, stretching and bending across the ridge in ways that made my stomach twist. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The echoes weren't coming from the valley at all. They weren't voices carried from afar. They were mimicking me. My words, my own mutterings, repeated back at me, warped and distorted, mocking me in the dense morning fog. I tried to call out to break the spell, but the trail itself seemed to resist my progress. Each step sank deeper into the mud, as if the earth itself were reluctant to let me pass. The shadows below the ridge lengthened and twisted, reflecting my own movements, but never fully taking form. I thought I saw a figure just for an instant, a human shape with limbs too long, too thin, but when I blinked, it was gone. The fog rolled in thicker, a living thing pressing close to my skin, damp and cold, carrying with it that faint, repeating chorus of my own voice. My heart thumped so loud I could hear it over the echoes, every beat matching the rhythm of the unseen movements. I wanted to turn back, but my legs moved forward on their own, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. The higher I climbed, the more distorted the trail became. Roots twisted in impossible angles, rocks seemed to shift just slightly as I passed, and the fog seemed to cling to me personally, leaving a trail of mist in my wake. The voices grew louder, closer, yet there was no one there. I started to feel watched, not by eyes, but by some presence that was patient, almost studying me, learning the sound of my breathing, the weight of my steps. At one point, I stopped and whispered my own name, and the response came immediately, a faint echo that felt as though it were whispered from right behind me, even though I was alone on the ridge. Panic finally took hold. I spun around, trying to find the source, flashlight cutting thin beams through the fog, but the shapes never stopped moving. They were always at the edge, never clear, slipping just out of reach. I stumbled, slipping in the mud, boots catching on hidden roots, and felt the cold press of the fog against my back, almost like hands brushing my jacket. Every instinct screamed to get back to the trailhead, to the safety of open ground, yet the ridge stretched endlessly, each bend revealing more of the same twisted, gray landscape, each echo repeating my own name, my own words, mocking me relentlessly. Finally, after what felt like hours, though it was likely no more than an agonizing half-hour, the ridge began to level, and the forest thinned slightly. The sun had risen fully by then, brushing pale light across the valley below. The fog lifted gradually, revealing the trailhead where my truck waited. Relief surged through me, but it was tempered by exhaustion and lingering dread. I looked back once, expecting to see the shapes, the twisting fog, something tangible to confirm what had followed me, but there was nothing. Only empty woods, silent and ordinary in the daylight, as if nothing had happened at all. Since that day, I've returned to the ridge occasionally, drawn by a need I can't explain, but the fog always thickens when I step onto those old logging paths. The echoes return then, faint at first, growing louder the further I wander. Sometimes it isn't my name they call, but fragments of my words, my questions, even my fears, everything I mutter to myself in the quiet moments, return to me warped and distant. I've tried to rationalize it, blaming fog, isolation, or exhaustion, but no explanation fits the feeling of being watched by something patient and unyielding. Even now, years later, when I hike near that northern ridge, I feel the same chill pressing against my spine, the same brush of unseen presence. And in those moments, I swear I hear my own voice carried back to me on the wind, always a fraction too late, always slightly wrong, as though the forest itself is remembering every step, every word, every fear I've ever carried. The ridge doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. And some days, I can't shake the certainty that it's still waiting, just beyond the next bend, to greet the next hiker brave, or foolish enough to follow its echoes. I volunteered to inspect the old fire tower on the northern ridge, the one that had been abandoned for decades and stood like a rusted sentinel over the Blue Ridge slopes. The hike up was longer and steeper than I remembered from my patrol maps. The trail wound through thick underbrush, roots gripping at my boots, and the air was heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. When I finally caught sight of the tower, it loomed over the edge of the slope, skeletal and worn, metal supports rusted, the wooden planks groaning faintly in the breeze. Even from a distance, it had a presence that set my skin on edge, like the forest itself was warning me away. I approached slowly, the wind carrying an odd melody that made my stomach tighten. Soft, mechanical, like a music box half broken and playing in the distance. I thought it might be the rusted metal clanging in the wind, but the rhythm was deliberate, almost tuned, and it seemed to beckon me closer. The ladder, old and coated in rust, rose from the base like the spine of some long-dead creature. Each rung I climbed groaned under my weight, sending vibrations up my arms. Halfway up I froze. At the bottom of the ladder, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, a figure stood, motionless, obscured by shadows. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My chest tightened, but I pressed on, forcing myself to the top where the small cabin of the lookout sat. Inside, the air was stale, coated with decades of dust, but underneath it lingered the faint, lingering smell of smoke, like someone had recently lit a fire in the stove and vanished. My flashlight flickered, cutting slices of illumination across the walls. Carvings lined the wooden panels, initials and dates stretching back 50, 60 years. Some were old and faded, others were fresh, the cuts sharp and bright, almost as if made yesterday. I traced one set of initials with my finger, feeling the rough wood, and a shiver ran down my spine. Something was watching me. I could feel it, a prickling at the base of my neck, hairs standing straight, a pressure in the air that was almost physical. I called out, half expecting a voice in reply, but only the creaking tower answered, the wind carrying its strange, lilting tune. The higher I climbed, the heavier the atmosphere felt. Every gust of wind rattled the tower supports, the sound amplified like a chorus of hollow metal singing just for me. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and I could have sworn the carvings themselves seemed to twitch in the dim flashlight beam, though my mind tried to tell me it was just a trick of the light. I stepped carefully across the wooden floorboards, each one groaning underfoot, and tried to ignore the tight knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. When I leaned against the railing to look over the ridge, the forest spread out in rolling green, but the distance felt different, stretched, unnatural. Shapes moved in the trees far below, fleeting and pale, like smoke rising from the valleys. I couldn't tell if it was fog or something else entirely. I decided to descend, feeling an unease that had begun to weigh on my chest. My boots clanged against the ladder, echoing through the hollow structure. Halfway down, I glanced to the base again, and there it was. The figure, standing as still as a statue, faceless and unblinking, silhouetted against the shadows of the slope. My stomach dropped. I wanted to climb faster, but fear made my limbs stiff. When I looked again, it hadn't moved, yet somehow the sense of its presence was suffocating. I forced my eyes away, gripping the ladder tightly, counting rungs as if that would help me ignore it. By the time my feet hit solid ground, I was shaking, sweat slicking my back despite the cool mountain air. I didn't look back as I stumbled down the trail toward my truck, but the figure's image remained burned in my mind, unyielding. Even as I drove away, the wind seemed to echo the faint music box melody, though I knew it couldn't be coming from anywhere in the valley. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting the shadowy shape to be following me down the ridge. That night, and many nights afterward, I could not sleep. The tower haunted my dreams, the rusted ladder stretching endlessly into darkness, the carvings that sometimes bled light from the wood, the faceless figure staring up at me silently. I began to question what I had seen, rationalize it away as shadows, wind, old wood, or fatigue, but every instinct in me refused to let it go. I felt the tower's presence even when I was miles away, a quiet, patient weight pressing at the edge of perception. Sometimes, when the wind whistles through the ridges at dusk, I swear I hear the broken melody again, faint but deliberate, and I imagine the figure standing at the base, waiting for the next person foolish enough to climb the old fire tower. Even now, years later, when I hike near that northern ridge, I feel it in the air. The anticipation, the pressure, the quiet knowledge that the tower remembers every footstep, every sound, every hesitation. It doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. I've never returned, and I don't intend to, but the memory remains, a subtle dread that surfaces in quiet moments, in the hush of evening, when the wind catches a treetop just right, carrying that faint, mechanical melody down the ridge. The tower isn't gone. It waits. And I know that, somewhere up there, the faceless figure watches still, patient, unblinking, keeping its vigil over the mountains. I had set out early that morning, the kind of morning where the world feels half-formed, like the sun hasn't fully committed to rising yet. The mist hung low across the old logging paths, rolling around the trees in slow, deliberate curls. Everything was wet, the ground, the branches, even the air, and the forest held a quiet I'd never heard before. No birds, no insects, no distant rush of wind through the canopy. Just a damp, waiting stillness that settled deep into my chest. It felt like walking into a room where someone had been speaking a moment before, and the silence was what remained of their breath. I kept moving, boots sinking into the mud with soft, sucking sounds, my eyes scanning for downed branches or fresh prints from hikers. But there was nothing. No tracks. No signs of life at all. The first sound reached me so faintly I thought it was my own imagination trying to fill the quiet. A broken call, drawn out, off-key, like children humming a tune they didn't quite remember. It drifted across the ridge in a strange, uneven rhythm, disappearing just as quickly as it came. I stopped and listened harder, heart thudding a little faster. When it came again, clearer this time, I felt a small, involuntary shiver. The sound wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It was just there, floating on the mist. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, pushed me forward. As I climbed higher, the fog thickened until I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead of me. The path twisted in ways I didn't remember, roots jutting up like knuckles from the earth. And beneath the fog, I started to see movement. Pale shapes sliding between the trees, never fully solid, always slipping out of sight the moment I tried to focus on them. My brain kept insisting it was just the fog shifting, but the way they moved was wrong. Too fast. Too fluid. Like they weren't bound to the same gravity I was. I slowed my steps, breathing shallow, waiting for the shapes to reveal themselves, but they never did. They only hovered, barely seen, just enough to make my pulse race. Then the voices changed. What had been distant, broken singing became something far more unsettling. I heard words. My own words. I'd muttered something to myself, just a quick, annoyed, keep moving, and a heartbeat later, the fog repeated it back to me. The same words, same tone, but stretched thin and distorted, like they had been dragged through a long tunnel before reaching me. I froze so hard the mud pulled at my boots. The air felt suddenly heavier, pressing at my ears, as if the forest had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. I whispered my name before I could stop myself, and the reply came instantly. My name, spoken softly, almost kindly, but from a place far too close. Fear surged through me. I tried to turn around, but the trail seemed altered somehow. The rocks had shifted. The roots had rearranged. The mud clung to my boots with a stubborn weight that felt intentional. Each step became a battle, my breath coming fast and uneven. The shapes in the fog darted faster now, mimicking my movements, every turn, every hesitation, like reflections trying to learn me. I aimed my flashlight into the fog and caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the beam's reach. Its arms were too long, its posture wrong, human but not comfortably so. I blinked and it vanished. But the echo of my breath came back to me from that exact spot, shaky and trembling. Panic finally took hold. I didn't care if I slipped or fell. I just wanted out of that ridge. I pushed forward, stumbling over twisted roots, the the fog brushing against my face with cold fingers. The voices rose around me, overlapping and spiraling, my own words repeated back in a strange chorus. Some were things I had whispered minutes earlier. Others were things I didn't remember saying at all. Maybe I had. Maybe the ridge had been listening longer than I realized. My legs burned as I forced myself toward a brightness I hoped was sunlight breaking through the trees. The fog resisted, clinging to my jacket, thickening around my face until I could barely breathe. Then the ridge suddenly leveled beneath my feet, and I stumbled out onto more solid ground. The forest thinned, the fog lifting reluctantly as the light pushed through. My truck came into view, parked crooked alongside the trailhead. Relief washed over me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. I didn't look back until I reached the driver's side door, and even then I did it only because some terrified part of me needed to know if I'd imagined it all. But the ridge was empty. No shapes. No movement. Just trees, ordinary and harmless, swaying lightly in the morning breeze. In the sunlight, it was easy to convince myself that fog can play tricks, that loneliness can turn your own muttering into ghostly echoes. But the memory of hearing my name whispered from 2 feet behind me refuses to fade. And every time I return to that ridge, and I do despite myself, the same heaviness settles over the path. The fog rises too quickly, too thick, as if greeting me. And the echoes start again, soft at first, growing bolder the longer I stay. Sometimes they repeat what I say. Other times they speak things I haven't said at all, things I've only thought, things I'm afraid of. The forest remembers. That's what it feels like. It holds every word, every breath, every fear, and returns them just slightly wrong, as though testing how much of yourself you're willing to recognize when it no longer belongs to you. And some days, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear my own voice calling back from the ridge, asking me to come closer. Not the voice I use now, older, steadier, but the version of me that first walked that trail, unaware of what listened beneath the fog. The ridge doesn't forget, and I don't think it ever will. I was driving down Hollow Road just after midnight, the winding stretch of asphalt that threads through the hollows and ridges of the northern Blue Ridge. The moon was thin, a faint crescent barely lighting the trees that leaned over the road like spectators in a darkened theater. Mist hovered low across the asphalt, curling around my tires with a damp, cold insistence that seemed almost alive. Normally, this road was quiet at night, the occasional deer darting across, a distant owl calling. But that night the forest felt different, pressing, patient, waiting. My headlights caught movement at the edge of the trees, and I slowed instinctively, gripping the wheel tight. At first I thought it was a deer, common enough on these roads, but the figure didn't move like any animal I knew. It stood perfectly still, watching, as though aware of me even before I noticed it. The shadows around it clung unnaturally to the forest floor, too defined for the mist, too deliberate for my imagination. I blinked and the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness, though my gut told me it hadn't moved. I drove on cautiously, each curve revealing more of the same. Figures appeared at the edges of the trees, fleeting and thin, almost human, yet wrong. Their limbs seemed too long, their posture stiff, like mannequins planted to watch the road. Every time I tried to focus on one, it vanished, leaving only the heavy, damp air and the growing tightness in my chest. I switched on my radio, hoping for a check-in with the other rangers, but all I heard was static, as if the forest itself had swallowed sound. Even the usual crackle of the night, the snapping of a branch, the rustle of a small animal, was gone. I rounded a bend and froze. Something leapt across the road, a creature with the shape of a deer, but its eyes glowed unnaturally in the beams of my headlights. They didn't blink. They didn't move with any animal logic. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other, two creatures caught in the same tension, until it disappeared into the fog. My pulse hammered as I pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between myself and that stretch of road. But Hollow Road didn't end. Each curve revealed more figures, always at the edge, just beyond the reach of my headlights, vanishing whenever I tried to look straight at them. The road twisted endlessly, and the mist clung to the windshield and mirrors. My breaths came in sharp, uneven bursts, the only sound I could hear other than the soft hum of the tires on wet asphalt. The feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't just the figures. I felt it in my bones, a pressing awareness that something patient and unmoving was tracking me, learning me, waiting. I told myself it was exhaustion, the isolation of night patrols playing tricks on my mind, but the instinctive dread in my gut was too strong. Hours, or maybe minutes, time distorted in that fog-shrouded world, passed as I navigated the winding road. Every straightaway felt temporary, a brief reprieve before another curve revealed more shadows. One figure, taller than the rest, seemed to walk parallel with my truck just at the edge of the tree line, but I couldn't be certain. Every glance forward or side to side brought only the same, empty space where the figure should have been. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, knuckles white. I whispered to myself, trying to break the tension, but the words felt swallowed by the mist. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the road straightened, and the sun was breaking over the eastern ridges. Hollow Road looked entirely ordinary in the light of dawn. No figures, no mist, no flickering shadows at the edge of the forest. Deer grazed along the roadside as if nothing had happened. Relief washed over me in a wave that left me trembling, though a lingering, gnawing unease remained. I parked at the next outpost, still shaking, heart hammering, and checked my mirrors again and again. Nothing. Only the ordinary world, sunlit and silent. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see them. The figures line Hollow Road in my memory, waiting at the edges of the mist, faceless and patient, stretching and leaning toward the asphalt. Sometimes, when I drive other remote roads at night, I swear I feel the same tension, the unnatural stillness, the eyes at the edge of the trees. Hollow Road isn't just a road anymore. It's a place that watches, remembers, and waits, and I know that if I ever return at night, those figures will be there again, patient and unblinking, tracking every movement, counting every heartbeat. I was following the tip about illegal campers late in the morning, though the ridge fog had long since rolled in from the higher Blue Ridge slopes, swallowing the trail ahead in thick, woolly gray. The mist made the world feel smaller, compressed, as though I were walking through a tunnel carved from vapor and shadow. I moved carefully, boots sinking into the damp soil, my flashlight beam cutting weakly through the fog. That's when I saw it, a small cabin almost hidden among the trees, its outline wavering in the mist. It looked abandoned at first, but something about it felt deliberate and waiting. The door was slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. I stepped closer, every instinct screaming caution, but curiosity propelled me forward. Inside, the cabin was immaculate. Plates sat neatly on the table, as if waiting for someone to return. A blanket was folded perfectly on the bed, smooth and untouched. Even the fireplace had embers long dead, yet the smell of faint smoke lingered, sweet and acrid, like it had been lit only hours before. I called out softly, announcing my presence, expecting maybe the campers, or someone else, to respond. Nothing. Only the echo of my own voice seemed to answer me, bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the fog outside. I moved toward the staircase, drawn by a sound that might have been nothing more than the house settling, or maybe footsteps. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, though the wooden floorboards didn't creak. I reached the top, peering into the empty rooms. Nothing. Not a soul. Still, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me, careful and patient, watching my every movement. My stomach knotted, and I turned back downstairs, half expecting to find someone waiting at the foot of the stairs. But the house remained empty, silent, as though it had been designed not for habitation but for observation. I moved to the window and peered out. The fog pressed against the glass like a living wall, thick and suffocating. Shadows flitted within it, shapes too vague to identify, slipping between trees in ways that didn't seem natural. I stepped outside, intending to call in the cabin's location over the radio, but the moment my boots touched the wet ground, the cabin seemed to dissolve into the mist. Its edges blurred and softened, the roofline fading, walls stretching and bending with the fog's movement, until it was gone entirely. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hands, scanning the area. Nothing. Only the damp earth, slick with dew, and the muted, ghostly sound of the wind whispering through the ridges. By the time backup arrived, I tried to point out the location, but there was nothing to be seen. The forest looked normal, unbroken, as though no cabin had ever existed there. The soil was muddy, flattened in places by my own boots, yet it offered no clues of structures, no hint that someone or something had lived there. My report was taken, notes jotted, but the officers looked at me like I had seen something out of a fever dream. Even in daylight, with the sun breaking through the fog at higher elevations, the ridge felt altered, haunted by memory. Driving home, I couldn't shake the image of that cabin. Its meticulous interior, the folded blanket, the lingering scent of smoke, and the eerie sensation that someone or something had been watching. The memory pressed against me, a weight in my chest that grew heavier at night. I began to dream of that fogline, of walking through the same thick mist only to see the cabin appear briefly, solid and welcoming, then fade away the moment I approached. It was a trick of light, I told myself, or perhaps the play of memory on a tired mind. But even rational thought couldn't dispel the unease, the feeling that the place wasn't gone, it was waiting. Weeks passed, but I found myself returning to the ridge, sometimes on foot, sometimes driving the narrow trail that skirted the higher elevations. Each time the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable, I thought I caught glimpses of the cabin, fleeting shapes that melted away when I tried to focus. The forest itself seemed to remember me, pressing against my skin with the damp chill of anticipation. My flashlight flickered inexplicably, shadows darted at the edge of my vision, and I felt once more that patient observation, the sensation of being measured and studied. I stopped reporting those excursions after a while. No one would understand. I could describe the fog, the damp earth, the isolated ridge, but no words could convey the uncanny precision of that cabin, or the way it seemed to exist only when unseen, folding in and out of the mist like some secret kept by the mountain itself. Even now, months and years later, I can't pass near that ridge without a shiver. The memory clings, a quiet dread that rises with the mist, a warning I can't ignore. Some nights, when the wind shifts just so, I swear I can hear the faint scrape of the cabin door opening, or the soft thump of footsteps overhead. I've never been brave or foolish enough to return after dark. Yet I know, deep down, that the cabin waits at the fogline, patient, meticulous, and hidden, as though it has been placed there not for humans to find, but for them to wonder whether it ever truly existed. And in that uncertainty, it lingers, a quiet, persistent presence that refuses to release me from its memory. I found the old ranger logs tucked away in a dusty cabinet at the station, the pages yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of mildew and pine. Most entries were mundane, trail maintenance, lost hikers, weather reports, but one line made my stomach tighten like a fist. It was brief, almost careless, but the words cut through the monotony. Something followed me up the East Ridge. Couldn't shake it. Don't know if I'll make it back. I stared at it longer than I should have, heart thumping in the quiet office. My curiosity gnawed at me, a stubborn itch I couldn't ignore. The ridge it mentioned was remote, the path long abandoned, and the dates matched a stretch of forest few rangers dared to patrol. I decided I needed to see it for myself. The trail was overgrown, moss-coating tree trunks and roots like a thick, living carpet. The further I walked, the heavier the air became, carrying the rich scent of decay and wet earth. It was the kind of smell that clings to your clothes, to your skin, so that even after leaving the forest you feel it pressing at your chest. My boots sank slightly with every step, and the trail twisted in ways that made it hard to keep a sense of direction. The further I climbed, the more I felt eyes on me, not the cautious glance of a deer, not the distant attention of a bird, but something patient and deliberate, like a hunter learning the patterns of its prey. Twigs snapped underfoot, but every sound echoed strangely, as if the forest itself distorted the noises. I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, slow, careful, but when I turned, the trail was empty. I called out, expecting a fellow ranger, maybe a lost hiker, but only the hollow sound of my voice answered. Each step I took seemed to erase a part of the world behind me. At one point, I glanced down and saw that my footprints had vanished. The mud was undisturbed, as though I'd been floating above the ground the entire time. A shiver ran through me, but I pressed on, compelled by a mix of duty and foolish curiosity. As I neared the top of the ridge, the forest grew unnaturally still. The wind didn't move through the trees, and the usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant birds, had vanished. The moss beneath my hands was damp, soft, almost alive in its subtle, deliberate grip. The landscape beyond the ridge opened up in ways that didn't make sense. Valleys stretched farther than they should, trees leaning at impossible angles, shadows that moved against the light. I felt the weight of it, the sense that the forest itself was aware of me, observing, recording, and shaping reality to its will. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something deeper, stubborn and foolish, urged me to continue. A subtle movement caught my eye. In the corner of my vision, branches bent, shadows shifting unnaturally. I spun toward it, but there was nothing, just the distorted, twisted forest that seemed to warp as I looked. I whispered the original ranger's name from the log, almost expecting to hear a reply, but there was nothing except the soft hiss of the wind, or maybe it wasn't wind. Each step I took toward the highest point of the ridge intensified the sense of presence. I felt watched, measured, like every motion of mine was recorded for some incomprehensible purpose. Finally, I reached the summit. The ridge opened up to the valley below, yet the view was wrong. Distances stretched and contracted, rocks that should have been near appeared far away, shadows fell in impossible directions. It was a landscape that didn't obey the rules of space, as if I had stepped into a memory the forest had painted, but not entirely correctly. I turned to look back at my trail, only to find it empty, the footprints I had left erased entirely. There was no evidence I had walked that path at all, no sign that I had existed in that stretch of wilderness. My stomach knotted, fear rooting me to the spot, and I realized that whatever the other ranger had encountered, it wasn't interested in being found or remembered. A sudden snap of a branch behind me made me spin, flashlight trembling in my hands. The trees seemed to lean in closer, shadows bending toward me, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw a figure, thin, patient, unmoving, blending into the moss and bark. It didn't move like a human, didn't breathe like a human, but its presence was undeniable. My heart hammered as the realization struck. This ridge didn't want witnesses. It erased what it could not contain. It waited quietly for anyone foolish enough to enter its domain, allowing them glimpses, teaching them fear, then letting them leave, or not. I stumbled back down the trail, boots slipping in the moss, muscles trembling from tension and fatigue. Each sound was amplified, each shadow threatening. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, yet the sensation of being followed never left me. When I finally reached the lower ridge, where the forest began to look ordinary again, the feeling didn't dissipate. My chest heaved and sweat clung to my brow, but the forest behind me was silent, patient, and still. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the moss hanging as if nothing had happened. Even now, when I think back to that ridge, my chest tightens and my pulse races. I know that something watched me, something older than any ranger log or map, and that its memory of me is stored in the stretch of moss, the bend of a branch, the impossibly silent shadows. I left with my life, but I also left a part of myself there, a part that knows the forest will always remember me, will always hold me in its quiet, patient grip. The ridge doesn't forgive, and it doesn't share its stories. Only those foolish enough to enter bear the weight of its memory.